Copper and Brass Incorporated. Founded by Paul Revere in 1801, fabricators of copper, copper alloys, and aluminum alloys for home and industry, and makers of the famous Revere ware, presents Meet the Press.
Our guest of the afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, will be Senator Paul Douglas of Illinois. But before we meet the press, let's meet Mr. C. Donald Dulles, Chairman of the Board of Revere Copper and Brass Incorporated, who has a special message for you.
At this time, we would like to say a word on behalf of the many thousands of men and women who make up Revere. We want to take this occasion to thank those who have given so freely of their time and effort on this program during the past year. It is no easy thing for any individual to expose himself to searching questions before a vast audience, nor is it simple to word questions which will bring out important facts or opinions and still remain impersonal and impartial. Meet the Press renders an extraordinary service, not only because it brings you new understanding of events and people in a fashion which is at once instructive and exciting, but because it typifies so well the American way of life. Too often, this American way of life is measured only by the physical advantages which we enjoy in this country. But we know that the real heart of our way of living lies in the freedoms which we enjoy. And we think that on this screen you will see our precious freedom at work. We would like to thank you, the audience, for your interest, an interest that is essential to the successful working of true democracy. We want to thank you for your generous comments about our sponsorship and of the program and about our products. We promise that we shall all strive to serve you to the utmost of our ability in the years to come. Finally, we wish to welcome those who during these coming months will come before this panel and help us all to understand and become an active part in the exciting days that lie ahead of us.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, meet the press. Ready for today's unrehearsed, spontaneous press conference are four of America's top reporters. Please remember that their questions do not necessarily reveal their point of view. It's their way of getting a story for you. Now meet Mr. James Preston of the New York Times, Mr. Lawrence Spivak of Mercury Publications, a regular member of the Meet the Press panel, Mrs. May Craig of the Portland, Maine Press Herald, Mr. Marshall McNeil of the Scripps Howard newspapers. Finally, Miss Martha Roundtree, moderator of Meet the Press.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, members of the press panel, and Senator Douglas. During 1950, Meet the Press has been very fortunate in having on its press panel some of the outstanding reporters on Capitol Hill. Through their sharp questioning, Meet the Press has kept you abreast of the news. In fact, it has made news. A newspaper man cannot report on the men and women who formulate our national and international policies without the background to interpret the information which he gathers. We have had many letters from you viewers asking about the news people who appear on Meet the Press, what they think and what they are like. Today we are going to give you a chance to hear for yourselves. Senator Douglas has been promised the opportunity to question our reporters today, and for this time only, our press panel will be on the receiving end. The reporters will do the answering, and Senator Douglas, if you run out of questions, our Meet the Press panel always has a good reserve, and they will take over. In the meantime, you are on your own as long as you can think of questions to ask. So let's have the first question.
Well, Miss Roundtree, first may I say that it is a novel experience for a politician to have the chance to question the members of the press. Until this afternoon, the shoe has always been on the other foot. Previously, the politicians who have been unwary enough to accept the invitation to appear on this program have been thrust into the limelight have been quickly stripped of their clothes and then, like St. Simeon of old, exposed to the whizzing of arrows, some of them poisoned, which come from the crossbows of the men and women of the press. It is a tribute to the healing powers of Christmas that it has led the directors of this program to reverse the roles and permit a member of that most abused of American classes, a public official, to question his tormentors. This is as unusual as it would be for a man to bite a dog. But I shall not aim any poisoned arrows. In the first place, I have no grudges to pay off, since I've been treated better by the press than I deserve. And secondly, I also, believe it or not, am affected by the spirit of Christmas myself, and hence I would like to keep the discussion on an urbane and friendly basis. But now, Mr. Spivak, I would like to ask you a question, if I may. Do not newspapers and newspaper men frequently weaken national unity by unduly disparaging the characters of our public officials? And hence, do they not often breed a mistrust on the part of the public of the good intentions of our government?
Now, Senator, if that is particularized, if it is aimed particularly at me, I would say that's a generalization or a senatorialization.
No, there's no personal animus intended on that. No, I'm speaking, is not this a general disease of the press?
Well, I wouldn't say so, Senator. I'd say about questions that it is hard ever to give a public official a difficult question. I will admit the answers sometimes are very difficult, but I do think that you people in public life have the obligation of giving the answers to the people, not to the press. Where the press is asked an unfair question, most of you are able enough to handle the situation, and almost all of you do, and do it very well.
But is there not a tendency to blow up small abuses and to represent them as great evils? And is there not a tendency to single out political enemies who are maybe fundamentally decent persons individually and represent them as evil, with the final result that people in the country as a whole come to believe that government is a racket run by people who do not have the interests of the country at heart?
Are you still throwing that question?
Yes, surely.
Well, do you think, for example, that the people of America believe that all government is a racket?
Well, I would say that some members of the press seem to be trying to give them that idea.
Well, Senator, I'd say that there are some members of the press who do a bad job, just as there are some senators who do a bad job. But if you judge the press as a whole, as you judge the Senate as a whole, I think most people will agree that both the press and the Senate do a fairly good job.
But can't we raise the level, both of the press and the Senate, by putting some pressure upon the people who indulge in vague charges, or charges which have a slight modicum of truth, but which are in the main incorrect? Can't we exercise some self-discipline? We are constantly being asked by the press if we politicians shouldn't discipline ourselves. And I'm raising the question whether the press should not discipline itself.
Senator, I'm in favor of that completely. And I think that if you will take care of the Senate, we four here will try to take care of the press.
Well, I think Mr. McNeil would like to answer that too, Senator.
Well, in part, I was going to say that maybe we'd be better off when you folks lift your cloak of immunity, Senator. Maybe we'd be a little more even there.
Well, I think Senator Hunt, in his proposal, that for speeches which senators and congressmen deliver on the floor, the government should be subject to libel suit. I think Senator Hunt has something
good idea.
in that
What
proposal.
chance has it got in the Senate?
Well, I hope very much that it would pass. It would need a constitutional amendment. But I think you are resorting to the favorite Yankee method of meeting one attack by launching a counterattack.
Texas. Let's not use that.
The Texans have that.
Let's not use that word
too.
What's your geography,
No,
Senator? Illinois, isn't it?
Illinois, yes, and by birth and upbringing Maine, Mrs. Creighton's state. Now, I will admit that I think we Democrats were unnecessarily severe to Herbert Hoover. But I think the Republican press has been unnecessarily severe to President Roosevelt and to President Truman, that people were unfair to Forrestal, reporters were unfair to Forrestal, and may have contributed to his suicide. and that at the present time, while I am not a deep personal admirer of Secretary Atchison, while I don't agree with all his policy, I think he's been subjected to severe and unwarranted abuse. And I believe the press should take these things somewhat serious and ask themselves whether it's necessary to crucify a man in order to get a headline.
Is that the question?
That's the question.
And who would you like to answer that?
Well, ask Mr. McNeil.
Well, Senator, I don't have an answer, but I was thinking of a gentleman from your state, Abe Lincoln. He himself, his Secretary of State, his Secretary of the Treasury, in fact, his whole darn cabinet was taken for one of the most beautiful rides ever taken in this country. It all turned out pretty well, didn't it?
Well, it happened to turn out well because we had an intellectual and spiritual genius in the White House. But that only happens very rarely. And the point that I'm making is, do we not subject public officials to too severe restraint? It's getting to the point now where honest and responsible men do not want to accept public office. For example, for some of the most important positions which President Truman has tried to fill, he has had from 16 to 25 refusals of competent men who have said they simply will not subject themselves to the mudslinging that goes on. Mr. Spivak?
Senator, may I question you on that one?
No,
Yes,
you're
sir.
supposed to answer
Well,
now,
I'll
Mr.
answer.
Spivak.
If
Well,
you
that's all
put
right.
a searchlight on a man, you're bound to expose some of his warts if he has any, too. The question is, aren't you in danger, greater danger, as far as the free press of America is concerned, if you don't turn that searchlight on as often as you ought to?
Well, I'm not asking for immunity from the searchlight, nor am I asking for immunity from criticism. Criticism is necessary to prick the stuffed shirts, to show up the occasional villain, as a counteraction against the undue puffing up of a man by his press agents, simply raising the question as to whether the opposite process has now not gone so far that men who are competent to fill public office shun it because they know they will be exposed to a terrific barrage of unjustified fire. Mrs. Craig?
Well, Senator, it seems to me you are posing a fundamental question of democracy there. Because unless you raise all level of the people's action and thinking, I don't see how you can take one part out and do it. Now, just a moment. The politicians, including both parties who go out, seems to me, do almost worse than the press do in tearing down the opposite side. That's bad, too. But when you start to coerce people to make them do right, then you get into something which is absolutely un-American. And I don't see how you can make the press rise unless you raise the level of all of us. And I don't think you can do that by dictatorship and coercion.
Oh, I'm not proposing dictatorship. I'm proposing a greater sense of responsibility on the part of the press itself. What you're saying, if you carry it far enough, is that the press cannot rise higher than the supposed level of the people whom it serves. But as a matter of fact, the ferocity with which the press treats personalities helps to create this very frame of mind in the people, and you get into a vicious circle. Now let me give an illustration, if I may. I'm not a Christian Scientist, but I read the Christian Science Monitor every day. I think it is the best paper in the United States. It's a paper which is not in a hurry to get to the news. It's willing to wait and let the dust settle for a few hours. And then when the report comes out, it is pure news. It is factually correct. There's a certain sense of balance and proportion to it. And you read it being informed and not inflamed. Now, what I'm asking is there not room for more of the spirit of the Christian Science Monitor in all the newspapers of the country?
Yes, sir, so far as that is concerned, but I would not have all newspapers alike, and I wouldn't have all people alike or all parties alike. And when you try to coerce a press...
Oh, we're not going to coerce the press. We're merely asking the press in this Christmas season to have its glance go inward as well as outward.
Well, I would like that to be done,
scrutinize
yes.
its faults, and then perhaps see whether there is not need and room for some improvement.
Well, don't you know that we all do that? We all try, just as you politicians try. But come an election, after all, if we were only to report what you did, it would be pretty bad.
I think Mr. Reston has wanted to answer that, Senator.
Well, Senator, I would just like to make this point. I I think the answer to your question is that we could, without any doubt, raise the level higher than we have. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think the best point that perhaps could be made about it, however, is that at the present time we are not getting effective criticism because perhaps that criticism is too personal. That we cannot defend good criticism by the kind of criticism we are now getting, because we are not dividing on principle at the present time. We're dividing more or less on personality. We are not debating, we are choosing up sides on people, and that is not good criticism. And I think we could improve.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because that's precisely what I would like to see the press do. Of course we shouldn't think alike, we won't. But isn't it important to have the issues discussed rather than the issue to become whether you like Secretary Atchison's mustache or whether you think he is too much of a rotten man.
Just a moment,
Senator,
now, one at a time. Mr. Spivak, and then...
Senator, I think you forget for a moment that the press really doesn't start a war, it reports a war. And a good deal of the criticism that you aim at the press should be aimed at the people who make the news that we report. Now, the people who editorialize on the news aren't read nearly so much as you think as the news reporters are. The front page stories are the stories, for the most part, that you people in government make for us to report.
Well,
and if they're bad, the reports are pretty bad.
May I say this? In the first place, small incidents are frequently blown up with disproportionate importance. And second, wild charges will be made one day, will be given a terrific play by the newspapers, and then when their falsity has been demonstrated a week later, the retraction will appear on the inside pages. Let me take the case of Mrs. Rosenberg.
Senator,
Terrible charges were made against Mrs. Rosenberg. They appeared on page 1 of nearly all the newspapers of the country, frequently played up in a lurid fashion. About 10 days later, it was discovered that these charges were completely false. The Armed Services Committee, which is a conservative committee, voted unanimously to report her out, and it's apparent that there's been a gross injustice done. The retraction, however, appeared on an inside page, generally page 10 or page 18, and only a small fraction of people who saw the original charge knew of the retraction.
Well, Senator, wasn't some of the responsibility on the Armed Services Committee that listened to the irresponsible charges of some of those irresponsible people?
No, if they had not listened, they would have been accused of not giving an adequate investigation of the charges. They had to listen. It was a tribute to the democratic process that the falsity of those charges were winnowed.
Well, must the Senate listen to every and any irresponsible person who comes along?
If we don't, we're accused of shielding the guilty.
Well,
now, Mr. McNeil.
Well, suppose you say you have to listen to these charges. Would you like to have those not reported?
I would like to see the reporters use a due sense of proportion in the importance which they give to the story. We may remember that a year or so ago, charges were made about Mr. Hopkins being a traitor to the country and sending material out to Russia. Upon examination, that story completely collapsed. At least I'm quite sure it collapsed. Yet the retraction did not receive as much publicity as the original charge.
Well, that's a thing every newspaper man here and in the business is always up against. You never catch up with that first story. But, Senator, I wonder if you aren't confusing columnists and commentators with reporters.
Well, I think both have been guilty. Both have been guilty.
Mr. Reston.
I wanted to quote some poetry at this point, but...
Quote poetry.
Well, you remember the Arthur Hugh Clough's poem, A Modern Decalogue, in which he puts the 10 Commandments into somewhat cynical verse, in which he says, "Bear not false witness. Let the lie have time on its own wings to fly." Now, I don't think that is good reporting.
Well, Senator, haven't you got a problem here that is not only a newspaper problem, it's a problem of life in general. The unusual thing in life is the interesting thing. People want to know about what is unusual. They don't want to report every morning about the number of people in town who are living a perfectly normal, proper, decent kind of life. They are more interested in the unusual. And I admit it creates a problem, but how would you deal with that? Would you report, are you proposing that we report the usual rather than the unusual that happens in the Senate?
Well, I would say that it would be better if we tried to find what the fundamental issues before the country were, and to give a balanced appraisal of the various sides to those issues, rather than to seize upon the peccadillos of some particular person.
But would you say, sir, that in spite of the criticism you've made of the American press here, that in this untidy system of ours, that it doesn't hit one about as hard as it hits the other, and that on the whole it comes out fairly well balanced, or not?
Well, let me say this, that I think the Washington newspaper, men and women, as a class, are extremely ethical and try, on the whole, to give a balanced statement. There are exceptions, but on the whole, the character of Washington newspaper men, Washington newspaper women, is very high. But when this stuff goes out to the newspaper, then the lead writers will take hold of it. And frequently it will be distorted, and frequently bias will be injected. And I want to say that I personally have been treated far better than I deserve, but I think my party, the Democratic Party, is treated far worse than it deserves, because in general, the pressure of the press is against it.
Well, would you have suppressed Truman's letter about his daughter singing?
Well,
At the source, yes.
yes, the letter never should have been written,
I didn't ask about
and
that.
I'm inclined to believe that if I had been a newspaper man interested in the welfare of the country, I wouldn't have reported it.
Mrs. Craig.
Senator,
Yeah.
if you're going to start not telling what goes on in the ruling class of a country, where is that going to get you?
Ruling class of the country? I've never heard that the
Isn't
politicians
your part
were
of the ruling
class.
party?
No, indeed, we're not the ruling class.
Not come January.
We are the butts of all columnists, 90% of the newspaper men, the abused. We are the character in the Russian play, He Who Gets Slapped.
Senator, where would you put a story about a senator striking a columnist? Or would you suppress that?
Well, if it has to be mentioned, I would put it in small type on an inside page.
He's
It is
talking
not
about
a
a Republican, sir.
No, well, I would also put that in small type on an inside
If
page.
a columnist hits a senator, would you put that on the front?
No, that is the usual run of the mind.
No, but
Run of the course, and probably does not deserve notice. Now, I want to ask some questions now, and I want to turn to Mrs. Craig, if I may, who reports for main newspapers, and who, with a bland smile and honeyed voice, has been the siren which has lured presidents and senators onto the rocks of unwary statements.
I ought to get a raise of salary.
I want to ask
I
Mrs.
really
Craig a
do.
question about this interview which you had with the president about the atom bomb. I've been going over the record of that interview, or what purports to be the record, and it is clear that the president did not mention the atom bomb in his prepared statement, no reference to it whatsoever. Only as a result of questions which were asked, possibly in combination with each other, did he say that he was considering the use of all weapons, including the use of the atom bomb. But that was played up in the dispatches which went out from Washington, and then the lead writers in the papers all over the world said that Truman was going to use the atom bomb, and the result was that it stirred up tremendous animosity against the United States on the part of the people of Great Britain and France. Now I'd like to ask this question. Should you pursue these questions to their ultimate limit to try to worm out of a public official delicate matters which perhaps should not be given to the public eye? If I may use an illustration, suppose a young man and a young woman are interested in each other, are paying court to each other. If a reporter comes around constantly and asks them the state of their feelings and what their intentions are, it will generally break up a beautiful romance and prevent the event from being consummated. Similarly, this constant prying into issues in the attempt to find out what is going to happen or what is being contemplated, does not that defeat the freedom of action of a government?
No, sir. I regard a free press as absolutely integral in the democracy. And it's our business to get all the news we can as the
By
purpose
hook
of a
or
press
crook?
conference.
By hook or crook?
Not by any more hooking and crooking than the other side does.
Well,
the
don't you
president
have
did
your...
not have to
I
answer.
have read your questions, Mrs. Craig, and they
Yes,
are the
sir.
cleverest questions. that I think are asked at the White House. But they all seem to be aimed to get out information, some of which perhaps should not be imparted. And it's very hard for a president, first, to resist anyone with your blandness and charm, and second, as the questions move, with perhaps you helping other people, and the questions being laid in order with a military formation. At times, a poor, harried president or a senator is trapped, and he says something that is not in the public interest. Not in his interest, but not in the public interest.
But if it's a fact, Senator, doesn't that information belong to the American people?
Let me ask you this question.
Well, I don't know what your question is now. We've come a long way since the original question.
Oh, yes, I have more than one question.
Well, let's have the first one, and let me answer that.
No,
I won't tell you about that.
I want to ask about this, whether it is not true that frequently the press asks questions to which they are not entitled to an answer.
That is not our responsibility. That is the responsibility
in other
of the
words, that
official
it's a game, as Mr. Reston said in a lecture which he recently delivered out in Kansas, of cops and robbers. You try to get as much information as you can, and then we try to conceal from you the information which I think you shouldn't have, that it's warfare between us. Now, I would hate to think that that would be true, because you're brighter than we are. You have more time to think up these questions than we have, and sooner or later you get us trapped. It's not that we suffer by it, but that the country suffers. Premature disclosures are made.
Just a moment now. Just a moment.
I have been asked a question, and I haven't been given the opportunity to answer it. I appreciate the compliments, but I'd like to answer the question. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
The president did not have to answer if he didn't want to. That's his responsibility. He was given 2 opportunities in that press conference by reporters who wanted him to draw his attention to the fact that he had said something that needed clarification. One press association man said, "Could we clarify what you said about the atom bomb?" Another one said, "Could we have that for direct quotation?" Now, that should have been just like that, a red light for the president to realize that he should do that. But he didn't do it until a good many hours later.
Well, then you take the principle that you should get whatever information you can out of government departments, even though it does not serve the interest of the country, and let it be on the head of the poor public official to fend you off. Now remember this.
It's a dangerous business when you start controlling the news.
Oh, we're not going to control the news. We're simply, I'm simply asking that at this holiday season, that you turn the inward eye of scrutiny and of self-criticism upon you, upon the members of the press, and see if you're not a better person after the first of the year.
Mr. Reston, can you get a short answer in here?
Senator, I think you're obviously right. There are some questions we shouldn't ask. We should not ask the Secretary of War right now whether or not we are withdrawing or whether there is an order to withdraw from the Incheon beachhead, for example. But the point you've made on the atom bomb, I think, is a very bad illustration of the point that you are trying to make.
I'm sorry, Mr. Reston, it isn't fair to interrupt you, but at least members of the press, you know what it's like to be stopped in the middle of a question. Now, time is up. Thank you, Senator Douglas, for the wonderful, objective, impartial job you've done of questioning and reporting today. And now a word about next week's guest.
Next week, Revere Copper and Brass Incorporated will again present America's press conference of the year, Meet the Press. Be sure to join us then when our guest will be Madam Pandit, India's ambassador to the United States. Madam Pandit is the sister of India's Prime Minister Nehru, the former ambassador to Moscow, and the former head of the Indian delegation to the United Nations. Now, good afternoon for Mr. James Reston, Mr. Lawrence Spivak, Mrs. May Craig, Mr. Marshall McNeil, Miss Martha Roundtree, Senator Paul Douglas. Meet the Press is owned and produced by Martha Roundtree and Lawrence Spivak, brought to you each week by Revere Copper and Brass Incorporated.
NBC Television.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.